Hi everyone, it's me, Sue Zimmer from the Student Success Commons here with another video for Human Anatomy and Physiology 1. It's spring 2020. This video will cover the humerus. Here it is. So the humerus is up here. It's this single bone that you have in your upper arm here. You will need to know if this bone is a left or a right, but I think it makes the most sense for us to talk about ways to know if it's left or right after we've named all the structures on the bone. We can go over that at the end. Okay, so I recommend that you have your textbook out, if not the bones, which we have in the Student Success Commons or the lab at the school. Just something for you to reference along with the video. Okay, so the first structure for you to know on the humerus is the head. I'll bring it a little closer. Here is the head. That's going to articulate with your scapula, the glenoid cavity of the scapula. It articulates with it. Kind of looks like it does too. Just makes sense. Then you have a backup because you have the shaft, which is just this long part, diaphysis. That's your shaft. So that's just called the shaft on this. Then you have the greater tubercle and the lesser tubercle, and I'll try to remember to go over that again because it will probably be helpful to know the left from the right, because usually the easiest way I've found for students to locate those two structures is to know if they're holding a left or a right first. So generally speaking, we're just going to hold that up to ourselves. How would it be in me? That's what I ask myself. Then I find the head. And then I know the greater, Then I know the greater tubercle is just lateral to the head, and I know the lesser tubercle is a little more anterior, and it's smaller, so the greater one is bigger and lateral to the head, and the lesser tubercle is smaller and anterior. So I know that's hard to see from this distance, so I'm going to see if I can bring it up closer to the camera so you can see it. Maybe some, here we go. So here's the head. Turn it a little bit. Here's the greater tubercle. It's just lateral to the head. That's your greater tubercle. And then you have the lesser tubercle, which is anterior and a bit smaller than the greater tubercle. So here's the head, greater tubercle, lesser tubercle. So the lesser tubercle is more anterior, and the greater tubercle is lateral to the head. It's lateral when you hold it on the correct side, I should say. Next up, we're going to do the intertubercular groove. So the good thing is that if you master where the greater tubercle is and where the lesser tubercle is, finding the intertubercular groove isn't that hard because it's inter, so it's between intertubercular groove, in between the tubercles, and it's a groove, which is nice. So I'll bring it up close. Intertubercular groove. Maybe if I put a little shading on it, right there is the intertubercular groove, right between the two tubercles, right there. Next up, we're going to talk about the deltoid tuberosity. So I'll back up and give you that view. Back to the shaft of the humerus here. The deltoid tuberosity is just the bump right here, the lateral bump. If you're holding it the correct way as it is in you, the deltoid tuberosity is just this lateral bump here on the shaft, right here. So the head is facing medially in the way that I'm holding it, and the deltoid tuberosity is this bump. And I'll bring it a little closer, and I'll turn it. Deltoid tuberosity. Next up, we're going to talk about the trochlea. So I'm going to give you the view from far away. Here it is in me. So the trochlea is this medial bump on the humerus, on the sort of inferior portion of it. So here's the head up here, just to orient you. We go down, and the trochlea is here. So I'll bring it closer. This is the trochlea. Medial side, that's the trochlea. Maybe if I give it some shading, right here, that's the trochlea. Next up, we're going to do the capitulum. So we'll give you the faraway view. Here's the head. Head is facing medially. On this side is the capitulum. Some people think it looks a little bit like a cap, so they'll use that to remind themselves. I'll bring it closer. This is the capitulum. It's a little bit more circular than the trochlea, and it's lateral. If your head is facing medially, the capitulum is the lateral bump on the anterior side here. I'll try to bring it closer so you can see it. So this is the inferior portion of the humerus. Right here is the capitulum. Maybe if I give it some shading, you can see it better. So this is the capitulum right here. I'm not touching here. I'm touching right here. This sort of looks like a cap. Capitulum, trochlea on the anterior side of the humerus. Next up, you need the coronoid fossa. I'm going to say it like that because it's important that you hear coronoid, that N sound, because there are other structures on other bones that sound very similar, unfortunately. Here's my humerus. I'll give you the faraway view first. I'm on the anterior side. My head is facing medially. The coronoid fossa is this little dip on the anterior side. So that's the coronoid fossa. I'm going to bring it closer. Move my finger out. Put some shadow on it. And that is the coronoid fossa. Now, if you can think back on our mandible, we had the coronoid process. So be careful when you label those. The coronoid process is on your mandible, whereas the coronoid fossa is on your humerus. And it makes sense that that's a fossa because it's like a little dip, right? So that might be a little hint, a question for you to ask yourself. You know, am I looking at like a little projection, or am I looking at like a little dip, like a little crevice? Then it's a fossa. So it's a coronoid fossa. And not to confuse you, but I just want to bring up the fact that on the scapula, there's the coracoid process, coracoid. So it's like a C sound, but it's very similar. So the way that I try to remember them is that my jaw has a coronoid, my humerus has a coronoid, and then I can kind of touch them together. So if I can touch them together, sort of, we have to use our imagination a little bit, but if you can touch the coronoids together, then there's coronoid in the name. Now, if I can't really touch my chin to my coracoid on my scapula. That's how I know that on my scapula it's coracoid, and on my jaw and on my humerus it's coronoid. So make sure you can hear the difference there because it's very important. Okay, so we are on the anterior view of the humerus. This is the front of the humerus. I'm going to turn it around. This is the posterior part of the humerus. My head is now facing in the wrong direction. It doesn't really face that way in real life, right? Because right now my head is lateral. In real life, my head is medial. So we're looking at the back of the humerus. We have this little dip here, and that little dip here is called the olecranon fossa. So it's on the posterior side, and it's called the olecranon fossa. So I'll bring it closer. We're on the posterior side, that's the olecranon fossa. I'll take my finger out. That's the olecranon fossa. Then I'll give it some shade right there. That's the olecranon fossa. So on the anterior side, you have the coronoid fossa, and on the posterior side, you have the olecranon fossa. Next up, we have our epicondyles. So again, when it will be really important for you to master left and right, not only because you'll be asked if it's a left or a right in your test, but also because these two structures in particular, you cannot label without knowing accurately if this bone is a left or a right. So I know I have a left, and we'll talk about why at the end, but let's talk about the structure. So we have two epicondyles here, and they're right here, literally on the end, right here. Right here, those are epicondyles. So right here is the trochlea. Right here is the capitulum. But this is an epicondyle, and this is an epicondyle. I'm going to move it closer so you can see it. That's an epicondyle, and that's an epicondyle. That's the trochlea. That's an epicondyle. That's the capitulum, and that's an epicondyle. Now, if you just label this as an epicondyle on your test, you're not going to get any points because you need to tell Helen if it's a medial or a lateral epicondyle. That's why you need to know if it's a left or a right. Because if you're holding it the wrong way, you're not going to know. So like I said earlier, I have a left. So here it is in me. You should always compare it to yourself. You're a model. Compare it to your own body. Ask yourself if it makes sense. Since I have the left, I know this is a medial epicondyle. So if it's in me, then I'm on my left-hand side. That faces medially. And I know that this is a lateral epicondyle because as it is in me, that epicondyle is lateral. Some students have a hard time remembering the difference between the word epicondyle and condyle because there are other bones that have condyles and some bones that have epicondyles and some bones that have both. So how do you remember? There's a couple of different tricks to remember. We can think about the word epi in medical terminology and how that means above. So sometimes that's a little hint, the epicondyles will be above. But on this humerus, that's not super helpful, maybe a little helpful. But sometimes I like to say to myself, epi sounds like bumpy. So if I see something and I know it's like a condyle, but I can't remember if it's an epicondyle or a condyle, I'll say to myself, well, this looks pretty bumpy, so it must be an epicondyle. And then I'll say if it's medial or lateral. So these are epicondyles on the humerus because they're bumpy, epi-bumpy, epicondyles, medial epicondyle, lateral epicondyle. Last thing we're going to cover in this video is it a left or is it a right? Now, when this is sitting in front of you on your exam, you pick it up and put it in your hand because students are going to be throwing it all over the place. It's not going to be any use to see how it is on the table. Pick it up in your hand and ask yourself, what is this? Is it a left or is it right? You must have 2 reference points, bare minimum of 2. 1 is never ever enough. You must have 2 points of reference to find if it's a left or a right every single time. If you do 1, you're risking being wrong. And I see it all the time. So make sure you have at least 2 points of reference that work for you. Now, these are my 2 points of reference. You don't need to use them, but they're just the ones that I like for whatever reason, probably because I just always use them. So when I ask myself when I want to know if it's a left or a right, I know the first point of reference is the head medial. The head is medial in this situation. I like that one because I know my scapula is here and I know that my head has to articulate with my scapula's glenoid cavity. So the head must be medial. And it is. The second thing I'll ask myself is the olecranon fossa posterior. So I'll flip it over. Oh, the olecranon fossa is posterior. So then I will know in that situation, if those things are true, it's on the left in this situation. So compare it to your own body. My humerus head is medial. That's the first thing I do. So this humerus head must be medial. The second thing I do is ask myself if the olecranon fossa is posterior. And if it is, then I can feel confident with the fact that I have a left humerus. Or right, as the situation would be. Obviously, if you had a right, the head's going to be over here. So just be careful. Practice that a lot. And if you have any questions, stop into the Student Success Commons and talk to a science tutor or send us an email and we'll try to help you in any way we can. So happy studying.